It was just another routine meeting, the kind where everyone sits around a long conference table, discussing quarterly performance, new projects, and company goals. I had been in HR for over a decade, and I thought I had seen it all. But today, something felt different. I could sense the tension in the room, a quiet unease in the air. I took my usual seat at the far end, silently observing the interactions between the department heads and upper management. Anna, our newest team member, was seated at the opposite end of the table. She had only been with the company for 6 months, but had already proven herself to be capable and hardworking. Her reports were always detailed, her work ethic impeccable, and she had quickly become a respected part of the team. Yet, as I watched her fidgeting nervously, I could tell she had no idea what was coming. The meeting started as usual, with discussions about targets, budget reviews, and the upcoming product launch. It wasn't until midway through the session when the atmosphere shifted. One of the senior managers, Greg, who was known for his blunt demeanor, started to critique Anna's most recent report. His voice was calm, but the words were cutting. He questioned her every decision, suggesting that her analysis was flawed and her conclusions premature. At first, I thought it was just feedback. I've seen these types of discussions before, where senior members push for better results. But it quickly escalated. Greg's tone grew harsher, and his comments became personal. "I don't know how you've gotten this far in your career, Anna," he sneered. "This is basic stuff. You should know better by now." The others in the room were silent. I could feel their eyes on Anna, waiting for her reaction. I knew this wasn't just about her report anymore, it was about proving a point. Anna, pale and trembling, struggled to respond. She tried to explain her reasoning, but the words failed her. The room felt suffocating, and I could see the humiliation creeping across her face. As HR, I had a responsibility to step in, but something inside me hesitated. I had seen enough to know that this wasn't just a mistake, this was a calculated attack. And in that moment, I realized the gravity of what was happening. They weren't just breaking Anna, they were breaking the company's culture. And with it, they were signing our own collapse. The meeting dragged on for what felt like hours. Anna's attempts to defend herself grew weaker with every passing minute. Greg's assault on her professionalism continued, and I could see her confidence crumbling. It was clear that the others had taken sides, even if they weren't vocal about it. Some looked at their phones, others stared blankly ahead. No one was willing to speak up. As HR, I had seen conflicts before, but nothing like this. This wasn't just an issue of performance. It was a question of respect, of leadership, and ultimately of power. The culture of our company was being tested in that very room, and what was unfolding before my eyes was a stark reminder of how fragile it truly was. I had dealt with difficult employees, managed grievances, and conducted countless mediation sessions. But nothing had prepared me for the feeling of helplessness I felt in that moment. Anna wasn't just an employee, she was a symbol of everything our company had worked for. Diversity, inclusion, and a culture of respect were supposed to be at the heart of our mission. But here we were, in this sterile, cold conference room, watching as one of our own was torn apart by those very ideals. My mind raced with thoughts of how to intervene. But before I could make a decision, something shifted in Anna. She straightened her back, wiped away a tear, and with quiet resolve spoke up. "I've tried my best," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "But it seems like I'm not welcome here." The words hung in the air like a slap to the face. I could feel the weight of her statement settle in. This wasn't just a matter of professional failure, this was personal. And it was clear that Anna was no longer the only one in the room facing judgment. The rest of us were, too. The meeting ended in a strange silence. Anna left the room without saying another word, her face red and blotchy from the tears she had fought to hold back. The rest of us lingered, unsure of what to do next. Greg, unfazed, shuffled through his notes as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had changed. The damage was done, and it was irreversible. The next few days were a blur of awkward conversations and tense interactions. Anna was nowhere to be found. Rumors swirled around the office. Some said she had resigned. Others whispered that she was too embarrassed to show her face. I reached out to her several times, but she didn't respond. Her absence was deafening. The company, on the other hand, seemed to continue as if nothing had happened. The leadership team carried on with their plans, seemingly unaffected by the fallout. But I knew better. The undercurrent of dissatisfaction was palpable, even if it wasn't being voiced. Anna wasn't the only one who had felt the sting of that meeting. The entire office had witnessed it, and the damage was beginning to show. As HR, I had the unique responsibility of monitoring the health of the company culture. And what I saw in the aftermath was deeply troubling. Employees were less engaged. Collaboration had taken a hit. People were quieter in meetings, hesitant to speak up or offer ideas. The trust that had once existed between the teams was eroding, and the cracks in our culture were widening. I knew that if nothing was done, the company would implode. Leadership needed to address the situation head-on, but it was clear to me that they had no intention of doing so. Instead, they seemed content to let the problem fester, assuming that things would return to normal with time. But I wasn't so sure. Anna's public humiliation had exposed something deeper, a rot at the core of our organization. And unless we addressed it, we were on the fast track to collapse. The situation had reached a boiling point. I couldn't stay silent any longer. As HR, I had a responsibility to both the company and its employees, and I had to make a choice. Do I stay and continue to watch as the company I had dedicated my career to crumbled, or do I speak out, risking my position, my livelihood, and everything I had worked for? I decided to act. I called a meeting with the CEO and senior leadership. It was an uncomfortable conversation, one I had been dreading for days. But I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The company had failed its employees, and it was my duty to make sure they understood the consequences of their actions. Anna's treatment was a symptom of a much larger problem. I began, my voice firm. It's not just about one person. It's about a culture of disrespect and fear that's taken root in this company. And if we don't address it now, we will lose everything. The room was silent as I laid out my case. I spoke about the toxic atmosphere, the lack of empathy in leadership, and the erosion of trust among employees. I didn't sugarcoat anything. The company had lost its way, and I was determined to make them see it. The CEO's response was a mixture of defensiveness and denial. "We're a business, not a therapy session," he snapped. "This is about results." But I was undeterred. "And the results will be failure if we continue down this path." I could see that my words had hit a nerve. But it was clear that the company's leadership was too entrenched in their own ways to make meaningful change. In the end, they did nothing. No apology to Anna, no commitment to improve the workplace culture. Nothing. I left the meeting knowing that my decision had been made for me. I couldn't stay in an organization that refused to acknowledge its own flaws. I resigned that afternoon. As I packed up my things, I realized something crucial. By failing Anna, by failing to act when it mattered, we had sealed our own fate. The collapse wasn't just inevitable, it was already happening. It had been a few weeks since I resigned, and the aftermath of my decision lingered in my mind. The office felt like a distant memory, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the collapse of the company was only just beginning. Leaving had been the right choice, but it wasn't a clean break. I still kept in touch with a few former colleagues, and their updates painted a grim picture. The CEO, stubborn as ever, had refused to acknowledge the issues that led to Anna's public humiliation. The leadership team carried on with business as usual, pushing for results while ignoring the toxic culture that had been growing beneath the surface. They seemed to believe that the problem was an isolated incident, something to brush under the rug and move on from. But I knew better. The damage was more profound than they realized, and soon it would become undeniable. One of my former colleagues, Sarah, who had been with the company for years, called me late one evening. Her voice was shaky, and I could sense the worry in her tone. "It's happening, isn't it?" she asked before I could even say hello. "What's happening?" I replied, although I already had a sinking feeling. "The cracks are widening," Sarah continued. "We just lost 3 major clients in 1 week. The turnover is insane right now. People are quitting left and right, and no one seems to care. They're just pushing harder. We're all waiting for the collapse." Her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had been expecting this, but hearing it from someone still in the trenches made it feel all the more real. The company wasn't just falling apart, it was already disintegrating from within. The lack of empathy, the refusal to change, the toxic culture that had been allowed to fester for so long, it was all coming home to roost. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Anna's humiliation in my mind, wondering if things could have turned out differently. What if I had stepped in sooner? What if I had been braver, more outspoken? Maybe I could have stopped this, but it was too late for regrets. The company's fate had been sealed the moment they decided to let that meeting go unchecked. It wasn't just about one person, it was about an entire system that had stopped valuing its people. Without trust, without respect, nothing could sustain itself. As the days passed, the reality set in. The company that I had once believed in was now a shadow of its former self. The board would eventually take notice of the financial losses, and the leaders would scramble to place blame on anyone they could find. But the truth was clear to me. They had already signed their own collapse. And no amount of fixing the numbers or restructuring the teams could change that. In the end, the company went under. The employees scattered, many of them finding new opportunities, but the damage lingered. The culture that had once thrived, that had been the foundation of the company's success, had been obliterated in a single moment of cruelty. And as for me, I had learned the hardest lesson of all. Leadership isn't just about results, it's about people. And when you fail them, everything else will eventually fall apart. The days after I resigned felt like a blur. I had left the company, but the weight of what had happened still hung over me like a dark cloud. I knew the decision was right, but the reality of what was unfolding, of the company's inevitable collapse, was still hard to process. It was difficult to believe that a single meeting, a moment of humiliation, could trigger something so much larger. But I had seen it coming. As weeks passed, the ripple effects of Anna's public shaming spread throughout the organization. The toxic atmosphere only grew more intense. It wasn't just Anna who had been affected, it was everyone who had witnessed that cruelty. Even those who hadn't been directly involved in the incident couldn't escape its impact. The office became a place of silence, distrust, and fear. The energy that once fueled creativity and innovation was now replaced with tension. It wasn't just the morale that was suffering. Employees were leaving fast. I heard from several former colleagues who had jumped ship, citing frustration, burnout, and the toxic environment. Many had warned me that things would get worse before they got better, and they weren't wrong. The exodus of talented individuals left the company even more vulnerable. The leadership, however, refused to see the connection. They insisted that it was just a phase, or a few disgruntled employees, dismissing the wider issue at hand. One evening, I received an unexpected call from Maria, a senior manager I had worked closely with during my time at the company. Her voice was strained, and I could tell she was at her breaking point. "You were right," she said quietly. "Everything you warned about is happening. No one can trust each other anymore. We're losing clients, and the team is falling apart. The culture is in shambles, and they just don't get it." It was painful to hear, but it wasn't surprising. I had seen the cracks forming for a long time, and now they were wide open. The leadership had failed to recognize that culture, respect, trust, and collaboration was the foundation of success. Without that, everything would crumble. The company had become a shell of what it once was. The pressure to meet targets, the constant focus on profit at the expense of people, had taken its toll. The toxic behavior, which had started with Anna's humiliation, became a pervasive force. People were afraid to speak up, afraid to challenge the status quo. Everyone was walking on eggshells, uncertain of who would be the next target. The leaders continued to push for results, but they did so without realizing that they had already lost the most important resource, their employees. Trust was broken, and no amount of financial success could fix that. A few months later, the inevitable happened. The company was bought out by a larger competitor, and the remaining employees were either laid off or absorbed into different departments. Those who stayed, who had held out hope for a turnaround, were left broken, disillusioned, and bitter. The collapse had come, just as I had predicted. As I moved on to new opportunities, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired. The decision to leave had been difficult, but in the end, it had been the only choice. The company's collapse wasn't just a result of bad leadership, it was the outcome of ignoring the humanity of the people who made it successful. The company had been built on the idea that people mattered, but in the end, it had forgotten that very principle. The lesson, as painful as it was clear. Success without empathy, without respect, and without a healthy culture was always doomed to fail. And in the end, it wasn't just Anna who had been humiliated, it was all of us. In the days following the company's collapse, I found myself revisiting the moments where I could have done more, questioning whether there was any way to prevent that outcome. But over time, I realized the truth was simple. The company's culture had been corroded long before Anna's public humiliation. What happened in that meeting was merely the breaking point of something much larger. Leadership had lost its way in the relentless pursuit of results and profit, neglecting the value of people, which had been the very foundation of the company's success. And once you start treating people like numbers or obstacles, there's no going back. I tried, in many ways, to warn the leaders and even offer solutions. But most of the time, my suggestions fell on deaf ears or were dismissed as insignificant. The work environment, which should have been a place for growth and support, had turned into an arena of fear and silence. It was hard to watch all of this unfold from the outside, but at the same time, I knew I had to move on. I couldn't carry the weight of a system's failure that was unwilling to change. As time passed, I learned that, no matter how much the blame weighed on me, there were limits to what any of us could do alone.